You're listening to a CNA podcast. Hi, folks. Welcome to the CNA Correspondent podcast with me, Teresa Tang. So, this happened last week.
Hi there, Secretary Blinken. Pleasure to meet you.
Nice
I'm
to meet you as
Teresa.
well.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be with you.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, arguably one of the most recognizable and significant diplomats today, visited Singapore. It was part of a 10-day, six-nation tour of Asia, and we had worked for many months to get him to sit down with CNA for a one-on-one conversation.
We're going to mic up now?
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Wherever you're good.
Ever wondered what happens during those in-between moments of a big interview? Well, this episode will fill in the blanks.
How's your day been so far?
Terrific. We've had a great day here.
Yeah.
The insight that we get is also incredibly, almost invaluable. So
It's been
pretty
good.
good day.
Hopefully we'll end on a high note.
Good.
We'll also unpack what Mr. Blinken told us about America's view of itself in Asia as we sit on the brink of a new U.S. administration. Joining me to discuss our CNA exclusive interview are correspondents Simon Marks in London and Leong Kit in Singapore. Hey, gentlemen, how's it going?
Hi, Teresa.
Very good, Teresa.
I know you both can sympathize with me when I say I had a crazy week. When you're given an assignment, you're told you'll be speaking to a significant figure. It's exciting. It's nerve-wracking. All of the things, all the feelings. I know you've both been there. What's your game plan usually?
I have two golden rules, Teresa. One of them is an age-old rule, which is always try and get a good night's sleep the night before. The second rule is a bit more modern, which is during the interview, try to avoid anything that is going to go viral for all the wrong reasons.
Okay, that's a good one. I'm going to keep that in my pocket.
I've learned something new, Simon. Well, for me, I read extensively and make sure I know the topic that we are both going to be discussing. And I always listen out for jargons. I've been taught by veterans to never allow your VVIPs to hide behind jargons. These are words crafted by the press people for them to stay safe behind. So I will ask them to define, get specifics, and ask for examples.
Those are great tips. Thanks, guys. Yeah, for me, it was figuring out which areas to focus on given we had a time constraint. We were only told 7 minutes, that's it. But beyond the editorial, I take a lot of time to think about what would make my interviewee comfortable. So those first few seconds, we meet, we're getting their microphone clipped on. That point is absolutely crucial because when they're comfortable, I'm comfortable, and it's just going to make for a better conversation, don't you think?
Yeah, no question about it, Teresa. I remember back in 2003, and I can almost tell you the precise date for reasons I will explain, I did an interview with President George W. Bush at the White House. By the time I got in there, I was the third interview. He was doing 3 7-minute interviews, and he had not enjoyed the previous 2. I, however, had been called back from paternity leave to do this interview. My eldest son, now 21, had been born a week before.
Oh, wow.
So I walked into the room and I said, Mr. President, I have truly felt the power of your office this week. And he looked at me and he said, why is that? And I said, because I'm on paternity leave. My son was born a week ago. And it instantly broke the ice. And he suddenly put himself into a much better frame of mind.
That's an amazing story. Wow.
Well, for me, Teresa, I always make sure that I have a glass of water so that whichever VIP walks in, I'll just offer him. And more often than not, they appreciate it because they're rushing from point to point. And they'll take a sip, and then I'll just ask, oh, how was your schedule? Did you sleep enough? More often than not, they'll say, oh no, more rest is always good. And then you break the ice. He laughs, I laugh, his minder laughs, everybody laughs. And I remember when I was in Vientiane, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Blinken, and my first thought was, man, he looked exhausted. I mean, granted, he was on his Southeast Asian tour, but I'm curious, Teresa, what was your impression meeting him?
When we sat down with the secretary, we were the last item on his agenda that day. Earlier, he met with the Singapore Prime Minister, senior officials, and he had gone through a slew of events. We were the final thing standing between him and his flight to Mongolia. But I have to say, when he came in, he was so genuinely friendly. He was polite. And there's actually an article by Politico titled, "Is Antony Blinken Too Nice to be Secretary of State?" And it makes me laugh right now because having met him, Yes, he exudes those nice vibes. And the article says Mr. Blinken is famously polite, and he really is. Simon, you're in London, but you're based in DC. What is Secretary Blinken's reputation like there?
Very much as you've described, Teresa. He's a policy wonk. Someone asked me recently why there was no buzz about Antony Blinken becoming a possible presidential candidate. That's not who he is at all. He's never held elected office. And he and Joe Biden have worked together extremely closely for many, many years. He's always served for decades as sort of Joe Biden's kitchen cabinet member on issues of foreign policy. He is a very passionate man and compassionate. So when you see him travel, often you will see that at the end of an event, he will engage with people, particularly young people. He wants to encourage young people to learn about the world. And there's often video images of him talking particularly to children that may have been brought along to meet him about their hopes and aspirations. He's also a musician. He's definitely got the music in him. He loves playing guitar. He plays in a band occasionally. The band will be rolled out at State Department or even other events for visiting dignitaries. So he's a multifaceted guy, and he's absolutely not someone with any aspirations to run for office. He's someone totally mired in the policy issues about which he cares, and he cares about those very deeply.
I actually wanted to ask him if he packed a guitar or any other instrument, but I didn't get the chance. Mr. Blinken's team gave our team 7 minutes, as I mentioned, but we ended up speaking for nearly 15 minutes, and I actually ignored signals to wrap up a couple of times. And a note to our listeners, you can actually watch the entire interview on YouTube. Make sure you check it out. And off the top, Simon, I asked Mr. Blinken about a breaking news story that day. My editors and I thought it would be best to bring it up right out of the gate. Here's a clip.
A few hours ago, Hamas said that its political leader, Ismail Haniyeh, was killed in Tehran by an Israeli strike, and they're calling it an assassination. Haniyeh was involved in ceasefire talks in Gaza. What impact is his death going to have?
Well, of course, I've seen the reports. What I can tell you is this. First, this is something we were not aware of or involved in. It's very hard to speculate, and I've learned over many years never to speculate on the impact one event may have on something else. So I can't tell you what this means. I can tell you that the imperative of getting a ceasefire, the importance that that has for everyone remains.
Simon, the secretary is a career diplomat, and we know he's perfected the art of saying a lot without really saying anything, right?
Well, he did certainly on that particular issue. I mean, the news of Ismail Haniyeh's killing had broken just a few hours before you sat down to do that interview. And so I think that he was very cautious in terms of approaching the subject. It's interesting that he made the point that the United States had absolutely no prior knowledge, he said, of the attack on the Hamas leader in Iran while he was attending the Iranian president's inauguration. And in those very early moments after the event, what the Secretary of State was trying to do was basically almost follow the doctor's code, do no harm. He absolutely stuck to the administration's talking points, turning the conversation towards the importance of ceasefire negotiations and getting the hostages that are currently being held in Gaza out, even though we all now know that the events of that particular day have made it much, much harder to get those ceasefire negotiations advancing.
Yeah, the secretary was going from one event to another event. And just before our interview, actually, his staff told us that he needed 5 minutes to be briefed on the latest. And to me, it really spoke to how demanding a job like his is, right? You have to be on message, on the ball all the time. And that message he brought on his visit was all about assuring Asia that America is very much invested and committed to this part of the world. The U.S. was so clear about that objective. Kit, you were in Laos covering the ASEAN foreign ministers meeting at the end of last month, and Mr. Blinken was there as well. There were tensions, right? Particularly when it came to the South China Sea issue.
Yeah, I think these top diplomats, whenever they gather for such a platform, they do two things. One, they project that they're able to shake hands with whomever, sit down together for a political dialogue. But two, they also want to make their national message, put that across. And that was exactly what the Philippines did and what China did. Diplomats told us that Philippines had wanted to include a clause at the end of the joint document to put on record that there was some form of injury sustained on the South China Sea. Of course, that incident took place sometime in June. There was a sailor who lost his thumb during an altercation with the Chinese side. But of course, that paragraph did not make it to the final joint communique. China, on the other hand, it also slammed the Philippines for, and I'm rephrasing here, its megaphone diplomacy, being vocal on the South China Sea when there are incidents. It also warned the Philippines to not use US mid-range missiles on the South China Sea, saying that this would raise tensions as well as spark an arms race. But when you see these diplomats walking around looking important with their great entourage following behind, you cannot get a sense that there is tension. So these diplomats do a great job by projecting that they're able to come together, sit down in a room and have political dialogue, yet at the same time putting their national message across.
I knew that ASEAN was one area I absolutely had to touch on with Secretary Blinken, and in particular, the dynamic with the Quad grouping, which consists of the US, Japan, India, and Australia. Take a listen to that part of our conversation.
You mentioned ASEAN, and ASEAN centrality is really all about the bloc deciding for itself, its relationships in this region, and it's an incredibly varied group of nations. There's no one opinion of the Quad, but some members are fearful. Some members see the potential of the Quad being a regional order-making institution. What would you say to those members who have that fear?
I'd say that what the Quad is and the other arrangements that we have are complementary to, supportive of ASEAN and its central mission and core mission. What we're interested in doing is finding ways to make sure that we have the most effective vehicles for addressing particular problems. And in places that can be done very effectively working with and through ASEAN, there are other places where having specific fit-for-purpose arrangements among countries makes the most sense. And with the Quad, we bring a lot of resources to bear. We bring some unique capacities to bear. We bring some different relationships to bear. And we hope that that can make a difference. But in doing things that are in the interests of, for example, all of the ASEAN countries.
Wykit, you cover ASEAN extensively. Hearing that, what do you think members would make of Mr. Blinken's answer?
ASEAN as a bloc would lap up that answer because he's using language that ASEAN is very familiar with. He mentioned central mission, which is your ASEAN centrality. These are words, music to ASEAN as a bloc's ears. And also his message was on the same page as ASEAN as a bloc. But that's on the diplomatic front. We know that ASEAN is split. There will be some ASEAN member states who would want to take advantage of their recent ties with Japan, ride on that, leverage on that, and perhaps have a bigger voice on the security front when it comes to Japan and Quad. But then there will be other members who are closer to China, who may not be so enthusiastic about this position, perhaps also reflecting China's view that Quad is a destabilizing actor for the region.
Simon, you mentioned earlier Mr. Blinken has worked alongside President Biden for a really long time, more than 2 decades. And the secretary is both a friend and a longtime advisor. Given we're about to see a new leader installed in the United States, I asked the secretary about the future. Listen to this.
What would you tell the next American president? What should be a priority for them, for Asia?
If you look at where I think the overwhelming majority of Americans are, they are for the United States. That's engaged, that's leading, that's working in partnership with others, not doing things alone. I think they know both intuitively and in a very practical way that we're going to be much more effective if we can make common cause with other countries to actually get things done. And that's, I think, reflects the overwhelming majority of Americans. For the next president, well, far be it for me to give advice, but I think I can tell you this, because I know this working for both of them. Both President Biden and Vice President Harris believe strongly that, first, when the United States is not engaged, if we're not leading, then probably someone else is, and maybe not in a way that's going to advance our interests and values.
Simon, we heard Mr. Blinken there say, quote, if we're not leading, then probably someone else is. Now, he doesn't name names, but who are we talking about here?
Well, he's clearly talking about China, but in this interview, he never allowed himself to articulate the word China at all, which must require an extraordinary degree of discipline given the centrality of China and its expansionist aims and ambitions in American foreign policy, particularly as Mr. Blinken was engaging in that regional trip. But look, the United States, whether he articulates the name of the country or not, absolutely is focused on trying to improve its own partnerships and alliances in the region, in trying to burnish its own credentials in the region, because the Biden administration has realized, and its critics argue it's realized this too late, that the United States over the last several years has not done enough to burnish some of those credentials. So this visit, to a considerable degree, was substantially about China, but it is interesting that he never used the name of the country, never discussed President Xi Jinping at all in any sense, given that that absolutely lies front and center of America's policy in the region and of the need for the United States to try and deepen ties because of the fear in Washington that to some extent China has stolen a march, not just in the Asia-Pacific region, but in other parts of the world as well, during particularly the Trump administration, but also arguably prior to that as well.
Waikit, ASEAN has taken pains to maintain strong relations with its dialogue partners, some of them not always friendly to each other. How delicate is this balance, and how do you see ASEAN-US ties post-election?
ASEAN by now is very used to leadership change once every 5 years or so. Some leadership changes, easy to handle, others a lot trickier. For instance, there is no post-Myanmar election plan as yet. So you're going to have to think about how ASEAN will have to navigate those ties with Myanmar if the junta were to hold elections. There are other ties that are also more delicate. We're talking about your China-US relations. But you ask any minister in ASEAN, any diplomat, any foreign service officer, they will tell you that ASEAN will not and cannot interfere with leadership change. They will work with whomever is elected, and they will not want to choose sides. Again, diplomatic talk, because people have already chosen sides. If you recall, this year there was a local think tank, IC's Yusuf Ishak Institute, and they ran a survey launched a few years ago. For the first time, respondents picked China when asked to choose sides. And I remember having lunch with a US diplomat not too long ago, and of course this topic came up. His response, as expected, was, Washington is keeping a close watch on this, and of course Washington values the relations it has with Asia. But Teresa, you spoke to Mr. Blinken, and he talked about these relations and the importance of them. Let's take a listen.
As we're looking at the world, we see that virtually none of the challenges that we have to address that actually impact the lives of Americans can we effectively, successfully do alone. It requires doing things in partnership of one kind or another, with different countries, with different institutions, with different actors.
So it's clear, Simon, that engagement with the Indo-Pacific will continue. What happens, though, to all of these ideas, these strategies, in the event of a Donald Trump victory in November?
Well, I think that is very hard at this point to project. And whatever the case, the outcome of the American election in November, there are big changes coming. Kamala Harris has made it absolutely clear that Joe Biden's national security team, Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin will not be part of any government that she forms. She's going to bring her own people in, as of course will former President Donald Trump. Now, if you look at some of the rhetoric that we heard at the Republican convention in Milwaukee just a few days ago, the argument that was being advanced by Senator J.D. Vance, Donald Trump's running mate, and others, was that, in J.D. Vance's words, any nation that had taken advantage of America's generosity, particularly in terms of security provisions, would find itself dealing with a very different United States of America. Now, what does that mean, for example, for the Korean Peninsula? What does it mean in terms of the possibility of Donald Trump saying to the South Koreans, you want continued military cover? You need to pay for it, in exactly the same way, of course, as Donald Trump advanced that argument towards several NATO members that he argued were not, as he puts it, paying their dues, by which he means committing 2% of GDP to defense expenditure. So there's all sorts of questions in the event of a Trump victory that will hang over America's alliances and partners if Donald Trump moves to that sort of much more transactional approach. However, the Republicans say that what Donald Trump does want to do is pivot away from Europe, that Europe needs to start taking care of itself, and that what a second Trump administration is going to be all about is pivoting towards the Asia-Pacific region in a bid further to confront China. Now, the detail of that remains at this point unknowable. On the flip side of the coin, Kamala Harris will be moving her own people in, and principal among them is likely to be her current foreign policy national security advisor, Philip Gordon. He's a confirmed Atlanticist. He loves Europe. He speaks, I think, 5 separate languages, all of them European. He himself is going to have to engage in something of a pivot towards the Asia-Pacific region. So whatever happens, whichever party now wins the November election, which of course is suddenly looking much more competitive than it was just a few weeks ago after Joe Biden decided to abandon his re-election quest, there are potentially going to be some shifts and some changes ahead.
Well, Teresa, if you allow me, let's wrap this episode a little bit differently. What were the main things that you took away from your one-on-one with the U.S. Secretary of State?
Like we said earlier, Mr. Blinken is a career diplomat. He knows what to say. He knows how to say it. And I knew I wasn't going to get any spicy clips from this guy. He held on to his core talking points and he stuck to them. But he did make that comment about if the U.S. is not engaged, not leading in this region, someone else will. And to me, that reflected the American mindset. And I wanted to ask him about that, how some in this part of the world have criticized that mantra of a free and open Indo-Pacific and how it's actually code for an American-aligned Indo-Pacific. But we didn't get a chance to talk about that. Besides the issues, though, I want to point out this interview required a lot of people. You guys know how many people are involved, right? I was speaking to one of the secretary's staff members, and she told me she goes to every country Mr. Blinken will travel to about 10 days in advance. And then she and her team go and recce, they scope out locations, potential security issues. Then a week later, she travels back there with the secretary. Isn't that crazy? I was like, oh my gosh, that is a lot of traveling to do. And you can't see it, but standing behind Mr. Blinken in my line of sight were more than a half a dozen people, part of his entourage, bodyguards, Secret Service agents, other staff. And before he came into the room where we were having our interview, 2 Secret Service agents, they came into the doorway, they looked me up and down, they scanned the room, and they wanted to make sure everything was secure. And finally, I have to give a quick shout out to our crew, Osman, Joseph, and Niaz. They were so on the ball, got there hours early to make sure the shot was perfect. And these interviews can be kind of stressful. You have a big interview that your bosses are going to watch, your parents, the public, and the crew kept things very light and fun as we waited. It was such a great experience.
And you need to be able to have a crew that can boldly say, sorry, Minister, you're going to have to move a little bit because the plant behind the background is peeking out of your head, or a soundman to say, stop, I'm so sorry, you may have to redo that because there was a passing plane and the quality will be affected. So you need all this people to watch your back as well to ensure that the interview goes well.
Some time ago, I did an interview with a top fashion designer in New York City. And we got there hours early and we set everything up. Big name in the fashion industry. I will not name the designer in question. And the designer in question arrives and he sits down in the chair, and we'd been there for hours, perfect lighting, perfect shot. And he says, that's the wrong side for me. We need to change everything. I prefer being filmed from the other side.
Oh, no.
So we had to change everything in about 10 minutes.
Oh, my gosh. Wow. You can always plan, but things will come up. That's just this business.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
That was fun. Simon, Wykit, thank you both so much for joining me today. Always a good time with you guys.
Thank you.
Cheers, Teresa.
And a reminder again that interview with the U.S. Secretary of State lives on YouTube. Go take a look. And TV episodes of the CNA Correspondent program air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, and find the latest on CNA.Asia as well. The team behind this week's episode is Saya Win, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and myself, Teresa Tang. Thanks for joining us.
Secretary Blinken, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for speaking
Thanks.
to CNA.
Great to be with you. Thank you. Thanks.